It started with a letter. A simple, formally worded notice slipped into my mailbox carrying the kind of tone that dripped with bureaucratic arrogance. At first, I thought it was another one of those pointless HOA notices, the kind that threatened ridiculous fines for things like the wrong shade of a mailbox or leaving a trash bin out for an extra hour. But when I opened it and read the words inside, my stomach twisted into knots. They were taking my land. Not asking, not negotiating, just taking it. The HOA, in all their smug entitlement, had decided that the unused section of my property, a strip of land I legally owned, would be better suited as a community park for the neighborhood. And just like that, they were seizing it, not offering a dime in compensation, and telling me I should be proud that my property would contribute to enhancing the shared beauty of the community. I felt my blood pressure spike as I read through the rest of the letter, outlining their so-called legal justifications. According to them, my land technically fell within a zoning clause that granted the HOA authority to repurpose underutilized spaces for the benefit of the community. It was complete nonsense. This was my land. I had bought it fair and square, and I had plans for it. Plans that had nothing to do with letting the HOA turn it into some picnic spot for entitled neighbors who already acted like they owned the entire street. I clenched the letter so hard my fingers ached. This wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. At first, I thought this had to be a mistake. Maybe a clerical error, maybe some miscommunication. Surely they couldn't just take my land without my consent. So I did what any rational person would do. I went straight to the HOA office to talk to someone. Big mistake. The moment I stepped through the glass doors of their little office, I was met with condescension dripping from every syllable that came out of the smug, tight-lipped mouth of the HOA president, a woman named Margaret Green. She had the kind of forced customer service smile that barely concealed the power-hungry control freak lurking underneath. "Oh," she said in a tone that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Thompson, you must have received our notice. Isn't it wonderful? Your property will finally serve a greater purpose." My jaw tightened. "You mean my land? The land I own?" I snapped back, barely able to control my anger. Her expression didn't even flinch. "Oh, no need to be so possessive," she said, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "It's still yours, of course. It's just being designated as communal space. You'll still have access to it. We're simply reallocating it to better suit the neighborhood." My fingers curled into fists. Reallocating. That was just a fancy way of saying stealing. I could barely contain myself as I asked her the one thing that mattered. "Where's my payment, then?" Margaret gave me a patronizing chuckle as if I were some clueless child. "Oh, there's no need for payment," she said with a saccharine smile. "This isn't a purchase. It's a community initiative. We're all part of something bigger than ourselves, don't you think?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip her desk over. But instead, I took a deep breath and narrowed my eyes at her. "You can't just take my land," I growled. Her fake smile faltered just for a moment. "Actually, we can," she said, her tone shifting to something colder. "And we already have." That's when I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't something I could talk my way out of. They had already decided. In their minds, the land was already theirs, and they weren't going to give it back. I stormed out of the office, my head spinning. My first instinct was to call a lawyer, but after a very expensive consultation, I got bad news. Technically, the HOA did have a legal loophole to stand on. Some obscure, decades-old clause in the original zoning plan for the neighborhood stated that undeveloped land within HOA boundaries could be reclassified for community use if certain conditions were met. And since my land was technically undeveloped, because I hadn't built anything permanent on it yet, they had just enough legal gray area to strong-arm me into compliance. I wanted to punch something. This wasn't just about land. This was about control. The HOA had been looking for a way to expand their power for years, and my property was just another pawn in their game. And I knew exactly how this would go down. They would bulldoze my land, plant a few trees, throw in a bench or two, and suddenly it would belong to them. They would maintain it, they would dictate what happened to it, and worst of all, I'd be forced to pay HOA fees for my own stolen land. Oh, hell no. I wasn't just going to roll over and let them win. If they wanted to steal from me, they were going to have to fight for it, because I had just made a decision that would change everything. They wanted my land? Fine. I'd make sure they regretted ever coming after me. I wasn't going to let them take my land without a fight. If the HOA thought they could bulldoze my rights with some flimsy legal loophole, they were about to realize they had underestimated the wrong person. That night, I sat down with every document, deed, and contract related to my property, combing through it like a man possessed. The legal jargon was dense, the language purposefully obscure, but I was determined to find a way to turn the tables. Hours turned into an entire sleepless night, and then I found it. A single clause buried deep in my property agreement. The HOA could only seize undeveloped land. That meant if I made the land developed, and fast, they'd be in violation of their own rules. A slow grin crept across my face. If they wanted to play dirty, I was going to make sure they regretted it. By the next morning, I was already at work. My first move? A massive, ugly, completely legal fence. I didn't go for one of those cheap white picket fences that could be kicked down with a bit of effort. No, I went straight for industrial-grade, reinforced steel panels, 8 feet high, thick enough to block out everything behind it, and topped with anti-climb spikes that made it impossible for anyone to get over. The HOA was going to get their little community park, not if they couldn't access it. By noon, I had construction workers on site, hauling in materials and setting up concrete footings. The second those first panels went up, panic rippled through the HOA board like a wildfire. Neighbors stopped to gawk. HOA members gathered in tight, whispering circles, and then, like clockwork, Margaret Green showed up, her face twisted with barely contained fury. "What in the world is this?" she shrieked, gesturing at the imposing steel structure already towering over her. "I thought we were clear about the repurposing of your property." I wiped sweat off my brow and gave her my best innocent expression. "Oh, this," I said, patting the thick metal. "Just a little privacy upgrade. I like my land secluded." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't do this. You can't just put up a fortress." I shrugged. "Actually, I can. My land, my right. And since you said the land was being reallocated for public use, I figured it made sense to secure it." Margaret's face turned an impressive shade of red. She knew she'd walked into a trap, because if she tried to tear down my fence, she'd be admitting the HOA had no claim over my land in the first place. Checkmate. But the HOA wasn't done yet. That night, I got 4 violation notices taped to my door. Each one was a different excuse: improper fencing height, unauthorized materials, failure to submit a community impact report, and the absolute best one: installation of a structure that disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. What a joke. They were scrambling, throwing every rule they could at me, hoping one would stick. But I had already done my homework. The fence was 100% compliant with local regulations. My permits were airtight. And best of all, the HOA had no authority over fencing regulations outside of shared spaces, which my land was not. The next morning, I marched straight to their office and slammed the violations onto Margaret's desk. "These," I said, my voice calm but laced with venom, "are completely invalid." She barely glanced at them before sniffing. "Oh, I think you'll find they are very valid, Mr. Thompson. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter legally." I leaned in, my voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "Do it," I said. "Take me to court. Let's put your so-called authority on record and see how a judge feels about your little land grab." For the first time since this war began, Margaret hesitated. She knew damn well that if a judge saw how flimsy their claim was, the HOA could lose more than just my land. They could set a precedent that weakened their power over the entire neighborhood. "I'll need to speak with the board," she finally muttered, snatching the papers off the desk. "You do that," I said. "But while you're at it, let them know that this fight is far from over." And I meant every word, because I wasn't stopping with the fence. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me, I was about to show them just how far I was willing to go. I wasn't just going to defend my land, I was going to turn it into something they could never control. The next phase of my plan? Full-scale development. If they wanted to claim my land was undeveloped, then I'd develop the hell out of it. Not with a house, not with a garden, but with a structure so undeniable, so permanent, that the HOA wouldn't be able to touch it without sparking a legal nightmare. A fortress. Not just any fortress. A high-security, reinforced compound designed to make the HOA's life a living hell. I was going to take their stolen park fantasy and turn it into their worst nightmare. If they wanted war, I was going to give them one. They thought they could bully me into submission. They thought I would cave, that I would roll over and let them turn my land into their precious community park. But they had no idea who they were messing with. The fence was just the beginning. If the HOA wanted to claim my land as undeveloped, I was going to make sure it was so overdeveloped that they wouldn't dare lay a hand on it. I was about to build something so imposing, so undeniable, so legally impenetrable that the HOA would never be able to take it away. And so I got to work, because this wasn't just about property anymore. This was a message, a declaration of war. The next morning I made some calls, big ones. I contacted contractors, security firms, and even a lawyer to oversee every step of what I was about to do. The HOA wanted to play dirty? Fine. I was going to beat them at their own game. Within days, the land was buzzing with activity. Concrete trucks rumbled onto my property, unloading tons of reinforced materials. Steel beams went up. Industrial-grade floodlights were installed along the perimeter. I wasn't just building a fence anymore. I was building a full-blown private compound. The centerpiece? A 2-story reinforced structure designed to withstand anything the HOA could throw at it. It had motion sensors, high-tech surveillance, and security features that would make a bank jealous. If they wanted a fight, I was making damn sure I had a fortress to defend myself from their nonsense. The HOA lost their minds. By the time the first steel supports were set in place, Margaret and her little board of puppets were already scrambling. They showed up in full force, clipboards in hand, fake legal notices at the ready. I was on my front porch when they stormed onto my property, uninvited. Margaret, her face an absolute shade of rage-induced purple, pointed a shaking finger at the towering structure taking form behind me. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill enough to make dogs bark. I sipped my coffee, staring at her blankly. "Construction," I said simply. "A personal project, private property. You know, the thing you people love to pretend you control." Her nostrils flared. "You can't just build a bunker in the middle of the neighborhood." I leaned against my railing, smiling. "I absolutely can. I have permits. I followed every single regulation, and unlike you, I actually own this land." Margaret snatched a paper from her clipboard and shoved it at me. "You're in violation of community standards," she snapped. "This structure does not match the approved aesthetic of the neighborhood." I didn't even read it. I just laughed, loud, long, and unapologetic. "You're joking, right?" I asked, shaking my head. "Because last I checked, you don't get a say in what I do with my land." And that's when the real battle began. Over the next few weeks, the HOA threw everything they had at me. Cease and desist letters, fake fines, petitions from their little minions. But it was all bullshit, and they knew it. Every single move they made was a desperate attempt to intimidate me. But I didn't back down. I pushed forward, accelerating the construction just to spite them. The walls went up, reinforced concrete and steel, thick enough that they wouldn't be able to break them down without a demolition crew. I installed solar-powered floodlights, motion-detecting security systems, and a reinforced entry gate so strong it could withstand a battering ram. This wasn't just a building anymore, it was a fortress that blocked every single inch of the land they thought they were going to steal from me. The neighborhood was in chaos. Some of my neighbors loved it. They thought it was hilarious that I was standing up to the HOA and making them look like fools. Others were horrified. whispering about the insane fortress that had risen in the middle of the community. And the HOA? They were desperate. They called emergency meetings, rallied their legal team, and even went so far as to send city inspectors to my property. But every single time they tried to pull something, I was 5 steps ahead. The inspectors, they found nothing wrong. The legal threats, dismissed outright. The neighborhood wasn't on their side anymore, not after I exposed their attempted land theft. The tide had turned, and for the first time, the HOA was losing. Then came the final blow. After weeks of failed attacks, Margaret did something truly insane. One night I caught HOA board members sneaking onto my property, caught on my high-definition security cameras plain as day, trying to tamper with my fence, trying to plant evidence. They were desperate to make it look like I had broken a rule, that I had violated something, anything, that would justify tearing my fortress down. But they had screwed up. Because that footage was the nail in their coffin. I didn't waste a second. I sent that footage straight to my lawyer. I filed trespassing charges. I filed a lawsuit for harassment, property interference, and attempted vandalism. And this time, they couldn't weasel their way out of it. The HOA board collapsed under the weight of their own corruption. Margaret, forced to resign. Half the board members, gone. Their legal fund, drained from fighting me in court. And the land they wanted so badly, still mine. Not just mine, completely, undeniably, permanently fortified against them. The best part? The fortress stayed, a monument to their failure, and every time Margaret or any HOA member drove past it, they had to live with the reminder that they lost. I didn't just win. I made sure they never forgot what happens when they try to steal from me. I should have known the HOA wouldn't go down quietly. I had humiliated them, crushed their land grab, and left them gasping for control like fish flopping on dry land. But power-hungry people don't just accept defeat, they plot revenge. And that's exactly what the HOA did. After their legal failures, their failed threats, and their public embarrassment, they decided that if they couldn't beat me fairly, they would burn the whole damn battlefield to the ground. The next morning, I woke up to something new nailed to my front gate. A special letter from the HOA. Bold, capitalized, official-looking, and dripping with smug malice. Notice of community violation and mandated removal. I didn't even have to open it to know what it meant. They were trying to force me to tear my fortress down. I snatched the letter and read through it, my fists clenching with every ridiculous demand. The HOA had convened an emergency vote, bringing together every homeowner in the neighborhood to declare that my structure was a blight and a hazard that needed to be removed immediately. They fabricated a list of complaints: fire hazard, aesthetic disruption, improper zoning modifications, all lies, of course. They even claimed that my fortress was interfering with community harmony, as if my refusal to be bullied was somehow bringing down property values. And the cherry on top? They gave me 14 days to comply, 14 days to tear down what I had spent weeks building, 14 days to surrender my land or face daily fines, escalating penalties, and forced legal action. My hand shook as I read the final lines. If I refused to comply, the HOA would hire contractors to demolish my property at my own expense. That's when I realized this wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a siege. And I was going to make damn sure I was the last one standing. That same afternoon, I went nuclear. If the HOA thought they could use community votes and paperwork to break me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. First, I lawyered up. I didn't just hire any lawyer. I hired the best HOA-smashing, property rights-defending attorney in the city, the kind who salivated at the idea of destroying overreaching HOAs for sport. Then I went straight to the city's zoning office and beat them at their own game. I had done everything by the book when I built my fortress: permits, inspections, compliance, everything. And when I requested an official review of my property, the city zoning officer gave me exactly what I needed: a legally binding document that confirmed my fortress was 100% compliant. Armed with ironclad proof, I marched right to the HOA's next emergency meeting, the same one where they planned to announce my final warning. The room fell silent when I walked in, their smug faces shifting into thinly veiled panic. I took my time strolling to the front of the room, pulling out my papers and slamming them onto the table in front of Margaret. "These," I said, my voice sharp as a blade, "prove that my fortress is completely legal, which means your little vote means absolutely nothing." The silence was beautiful. Margaret paled as she scanned the documents, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. This can't," she stammered, flipping pages like she could somehow find a loophole to save her. But there was nothing. No violations, no illegal modifications, no grounds for forced demolition. Her face twisted in frustration, but I wasn't done yet, not even close. I leaned in. "And just in case you still think you can force me out, I'd like to remind you that attempting to demolish private property without legal grounds is a felony." I could see the realization dawn in her eyes. If they touched my land now, they wouldn't just be dealing with neighborhood votes and petty fines. They'd be dealing with the law, the very thing they thought they controlled. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at the rest of the board, her fellow HOA members, her army, completely useless now. I had ripped the power right out of their hands, and she knew it. But still, she tried one last desperate move. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and plastered that artificial customer service smile back onto her face. "Well, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "since you're so passionate about this, I suppose we can revisit the matter at a later date." I let out a slow, deliberate laugh. "No, Margaret," I said, my voice cold. "This matter is over. You lost." And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving the entire HOA stewing in their own defeat. But the war wasn't over yet, because when people like Margaret lose, they don't accept it. They don't learn. They plot revenge, and that's exactly what she did. I should have seen it coming. I had embarrassed them, shattered their control, and left them with nothing to use against me. But instead of accepting defeat, the HOA decided that if they couldn't beat me legally, they would break me another way. 3 nights after the meeting, my security system caught them. Margaret, 3 board members, and 2 men in dark clothing. They weren't just trespassing this time. They came armed with tools, with spray paint, with bolt cutters. They were here to vandalize my fortress, to damage it, to ruin everything I had built. But they made one crucial mistake. They didn't realize my cameras recorded everything. And the best part? I had already set up automatic alerts to the police. Before they could do any real damage, flashing red and blue lights flooded the property. The sound of sirens tore through the night as patrol cars skidded to a stop right outside my gate. Margaret and her goons froze in place as armed officers stepped out, their hands hovering over their holsters. "Step away from the property, hands where we can see them." Margaret tried to run. She actually tried to run. But the moment she turned, 2 officers tackled her straight into the dirt. And just like that, the war was over. Margaret was arrested that night. Trespassing, vandalism, attempted property damage, conspiracy. And the board members who had followed her, charged right alongside her. The HOA's leadership was obliterated overnight, and the fallout was beautiful. With their leaders gone, the HOA imploded. Members resigned in droves. The legal cases I had lined up against them, every single one pushed forward. And by the end of it, the HOA was bankrupt, gone, dead, destroyed. And my fortress, still standing, a monument to everything they tried to take from me. And every time someone in the neighborhood walks past it, they remember who won, and who never lost a single inch. The HOA was finished. It had taken months of fighting, legal battles, and sheer, unrelenting defiance, but in the end I had crushed them. Margaret? Gone. After her arrest, she lost everything. Her position, her reputation, her standing in the community. The HOA board members who had followed her into the night like rats scurrying behind their queen? Also gone. Some resigned in shame, others faced legal consequences for their involvement in trespassing and property damage, and without their corrupt leadership, the HOA collapsed from the inside out. They had spent so much money trying to sue me, fine me, harass me, and control me that they had drained their legal fund dry. And when the lawsuits I had stacked against them hit them like a tsunami, the remaining members had no choice but to surrender. The HOA went bankrupt. The homeowners association that had spent years lording its power over the neighborhood, bullying residents into submission, stealing property under the guise of community improvement, was dead, completely dissolved. And when the official notice came in the mail, stamped and finalized, confirming that the HOA no longer legally existed, I framed it and hung it on the wall of my fortress, a trophy of war. But the best part? That wasn't even my final move. Oh no, I wasn't just content with victory. I wanted revenge. I wanted the HOA to be remembered not as a once powerful force, but as a cautionary tale. So I did what any petty, vindictive mastermind would do. I bought the land. Every single piece of property the HOA had controlled, the community clubhouse, the tiny garden space they claimed was for beautification, the street-adjacent plots they had snatched from other homeowners over the years, I bought all of it. And then I turned it into something they would have hated. I transformed the HOA's former headquarters into a private, members-only bar, a sanctuary for people who had been screwed over by HOAs in the past. I put up a giant sign above the entrance that read, "Freedom from tyranny, no HOAs allowed." Homeowners from other neighborhoods, even from outside the city, came by just to laugh at the irony. Former HOA victims would visit just to drink, swap war stories, and celebrate the death of one of the most hated homeowners associations in the state. But that was only the first layer of revenge. I still had my fortress, my impenetrable, unbreakable HOA-proof compound, standing in the middle of the neighborhood like a steel middle finger to every corrupt homeowners association out there, and with no HOA left to enforce anything. I took it even further. First, I expanded, more security, more reinforcements. I built a watchtower just for the hell of it, a symbol of how I had been forced to defend what was rightfully mine. I put up a flagpole flying a custom-made banner that simply read, HOA Free Zone. And then, I invited my neighbors to join me. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, the neighborhood changed. People painted their houses whatever color they wanted. Someone built a massive backyard pool, something the HOA had banned for years. Another family who had been harassed over unapproved lawn decor filled their front yard with a dozen flamingos and a giant statue of a middle finger. The HOA's iron grip had been shattered, and now people were actually free to enjoy their homes. But the real kicker? Margaret. After she was removed from her position and dragged through court, she tried to sell her house. But no one wanted to buy it. Why? Because she had spent years enforcing ridiculous rules, turning the neighborhood into an oppressive nightmare, and now that she was gone, her house was worth nothing. No one wanted to live in a place where everyone hated her. No one wanted to own the home of the woman who had tried to steal from her own neighbors. She ended up selling it at a massive loss, and when she finally packed up and left, the entire neighborhood cheered. As she drove past my fortress one last time, I stood outside, arms crossed, watching. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, because I had won, and she knew it. In the end, I didn't just keep my land. I changed the entire neighborhood. Without the HOA, people started living differently. Homeowners stopped living in fear of citations and fines. Kids played in yards that used to be off limits. Barbecues lasted late into the night without some power-hungry board member calling in a noise complaint. It wasn't just about my fortress anymore. It was about freedom. And every time someone drives past my steel-reinforced walls, past the floodlights and motion detectors and high-security gates, they remember, this was where the HOA tried to steal land, and this was where they lost. I didn't just fight back, I destroyed them. And my fortress, still standing, a monument, a message. A warning to any HOA that ever thought about trying to pull the same power-hungry stunt again. Because some people, they don't just roll over and comply. Some people, they fight. And when they do, they win.